Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of The Lowdown by Analysis.Tech. I'm John Rymer. I'm going to be one of your hosts today, and I'm with my colleagues, partners, friends, Dave Marcus. Hey, Dave.
Hey, John, good to be with you again, as always. Nice to do one of these analysis.tech alone things.
Yes, and Rob Koplowitz. Rob,
Howdy.
how are you?
Good. Thanks.
So, as Dave mentioned, this is an episode that is just us. And Rob and I are going to be talking to Dave about a project that he undertook some months ago. I think, as you all know, we've been spending a lot of our time, most of our time, understanding AI assisted software development, vibe coding, etc. And Dave likes to get his hands dirty. So he decided that he was going to get permission to use a number of vibe coding and vibe code plus low code platforms and do an experiment, bring an application project and see what he could learn about these projects, about these products. And so, Dave, we're here today to get the kind of the lowdown from you, the basics of what you learned from that project. So why don't we start, Dave, with which products did you look at?
Sure, absolutely. So, and as John said, I wanted to try to do this because, number one, I like being hands-on, but number two, there's so much that you can read that isn't always true. And so the goal here is just to kind of figure out, how to get a more realistic viewpoint on these. The vendors that I looked at kind of were designed to cover a range of players. So in no particular order, I chose two of the what I'll call pure play vibe coding plays, Replit and Lovable. I chose them largely because we wanted to focus on an audience here that isn't necessarily a pro developer. So that was pretty critical. I wasn't trying to figure out what this meant for using Codex or Claude Code, or Cursor, etc. That wasn't the goal. The goal is to figure out what someone who isn't necessarily a professional developer could actually do with tools like these, and in as meaningful a way as possible. So I chose those two firstly, then went and spent some time looking at a couple of other players, Microsoft, and a range of Power Platform pieces within the Microsoft family, because it's evolved a lot over the last little while. And then in the sort of what I'm going to call the traditional low-code space, vendors like Betty Blocks and vendors like Zoho. And then in addition to that, decided to take one or two players in what I'm going to call the sort of process automation space. So chose Pega, and particularly Pega's Blueprint platform as part of the Pega offering. And then Appian had come up with a relatively new vibing type capability that I wanted to explore as well. So it was sort of a range of players that cover this in a bunch of different ways to try to establish what I could experience with each one of them and what I was going to learn.
Awesome. Rob.
So Dave, whenever we're approaching research, obviously we want to isolate the variables. We want to come up with a framework of how we're going to approach the analysis. Tell us how you did it. What did you build? How did you build it? How did you establish the evaluation criteria?
Sure. So I noticed that a lot of people who use these tools will build what I'm going to call simplistic productivity applications. And my goal was not to try to go there. I could do many, but they wouldn't really prove very much. And at the same point in time, people have been talking a lot about this idea of, rewriting is probably a bad word, but reconstituting applications like customer relationship management, et cetera, et cetera. And so I looked at this and said, what happens if I choose a typical CRM type solution where I have a really good understanding of what it needs to be from a domain perspective, having used both a lot of these technologies and having built against a lot of these technologies over many, many years, that had a pretty good solid data model associated with it. I didn't just want something that had like one data source. That's only marginally interesting as well. This needed to have a fairly robust data model. I then also wanted to make sure that I could introduce integration from a third-party perspective. I wanted to keep that fairly simple. When I say simple, fairly simplistic rather than simple. And so picked one integration, and that integration just happened to be Microsoft SharePoint because I wanted to bring documents into the context of the application, but this could have been anything. And then lastly, I also wanted to make sure that I had some kind of formalized workflow process that underpinned some of what this application was, so that it didn't just become an application that was like UI on data. There certainly is UI on data in this application, but I wanted to make sure that it represented something meaningful from a process perspective as well. And so at the end of the day, it shows, as I said, a CRM-like capability from a solution point of view that, as you can imagine, manages customers, opportunities, actions and activities within those particular opportunities, and a range of other things associated with processing a customer lifecycle.
So, Dave, I mean, essentially, it's a fairly sophisticated application. I mean, you've got some fairly sophisticated capabilities that you're evaluating, and it would be deployed into a fairly critical environment, right? It's not if it falls over, it's fine. Okay, cool, John.
100%. Yep.
So you had among the products you looked at, you had two products that rely for development primarily on prompting, and then the others had both prompting and visual tooling. What was just top line? What was the big difference in the experiences of developing and delivering this app?
So with each one of them, I started with a sort of a common baseline, a prompting baseline. A couple of things about the prompting baseline that were sort of interesting in a bunch of reading that I did is I discovered that some people who use these products and their vibing capabilities, if you like, use them where I go into the product, into its conversational user interface, and I start prompting in whatever way makes sense. As we all know, the result you get is only as good as the extent to which you effectively prompt and provide the right context. And this was completely true for all of these tools. The thing that was sort of interesting is that with a couple of them, I noticed that looking online, people had recommended actually going to either ChatGPT or Claude beforehand and saying things like, Claude, I'm going to build an application in Replit. Here's kind of what I want from a generalized prompt perspective. Make me a more defined prompt that I can pass into Replit. And I just use Replit as an example. This happened with a couple of others as well. And I wanted to sort of experiment to see whether that made any difference. The reality is it didn't really make too much difference. And most of these vendors today do not encourage that approach. I think that at some point in time, people started just doing it because it sort of made sense to them, especially in the early days of these technologies. But as they become more mature, none of these vendors recommend that as an approach to, creating, if you like, a better prompt. And so I started there with prompting. I would say that even I, who am somewhat jaded and very critical around a range of these products, and I always have been, was surprised at what they turned out. You read a lot about the fact that I can kind of take an idea, give it some information, and have this thing turn into something that feels real. It works. You click the buttons, they do what they need to do. The visualizations make sense. And more importantly, it actually looks good. because there's a usability aspect to this that I think that sometimes we forget about. The fact that it doesn't matter how great the functionality is, if the usability just sucks, then the whole damn thing tends to just suck. And so it was really interesting to see how some of these tools did an amazingly good job on UX. Doesn't necessarily mean they did a good job in other areas, whereas other tools sort of took more of a traditional approach to what they created. But at the end of the day, there wasn't any of these tools that didn't, if you like, create what I'm going to call my idea to a working concept. They all did that. And they all did that pretty darn well.
Mm-hmm. Did you find that some of the platforms you looked at also, they have prompting, but they also have visual tools. They also have form builders or process or workflow diagrammers and those kinds of data modelers. Did you find at all that those visual tools were useful in the context of these projects, or
I said did.
Sorry.
John, so just to answer your question, I did. But I also have to I was trying to be very careful not to take my sort of visual tooling background and make it such that because I have that background, I'm going to naturally go back there. That wasn't the goal. But at the same point in time, let me just give you a really simple example. The tool introduces, a form amongst other user elements that we're working with to capture, a customer name or an opportunity. And I want the form just to look a little different. And by a little different, it's like the submit button should be in a different place to where the app put it. It doesn't make sense to try to go in and prompt the thing to say, I'd actually like you to move this button and kind of move it here, where here is often hard to describe in words, rather than just saying, let me just drag the button and put it where I want it. And more importantly, in doing that, dragging the button where I want it, I am not using tokens in any way whatsoever. And so, that was a pretty big deal. And, a couple of times I got to the point with some of these tools where I ran out of tokens. And I ran out of tokens not from a functional perspective, but because I was spending so much time trying to tell the tool what I wanted the thing to look like that was different to what it gave me. And then every time it was sort of like an experiment. It was like, you give me something and it's interesting, but it's not quite what I want. And so change it this way. And oh, by the way, can you go back? Because I liked kind of what you had before. I really don't like what you have right now. But I don't want to try and modify what you've got right now. It's just easier to go back and start again. And that's where I just discovered a whole bunch of frustration with a number of these tools that forced me into a conversational type experience for everything. And I will say it's not like these tools that have pure conversational experiences don't offer some type of visual editing capability. But in most cases, the visual editing capability was so immature and so early stage compared to what I'd been used to within traditional low-code application tools that it became somewhat frustrating trying to even use those tools. And for a lot of those vendors, once I actually ended up going back and talking to them, they said to me, they actually encourage people to not use those visual tools, even though they have them, and rather go back and go and prompt. And so it was a really interesting experience for me going through that process. The other thing I will say as well, just to add to this, is that, and as we produce the content and the research associated with this in a formalized way, it'll become very, very clear that having an understanding of kind of the model that describes these applications was really, really important, because the app isn't just some super simplistic thing. And so the lack of those for certain vendors made it really, really tough to kind of deal with them as well. And I had to kind of figure that out. A lot of the time vendors that didn't offer that would say to me, just tell the system to make you a model. and based upon the code that's there. And so I did. And then what I get is I get kind of a crappy model, and more importantly, a static model that doesn't evolve as I'm making changes. And so those were just one or two of many things that kind of were fairly tough to get your head around. And they're important from an ongoing manageability and life cycle perspective.
Let's drill into that a bit, Dave, if we could. Let's extrapolate from where you are to where you're going. Because I think there's something dangerous going on in the marketplace right now, which is the CEO builds a CRM application and says, okay, pull the plug on our existing CRM license and deploy this. It's free. That's not how applications work. I mean, there's a million problems with that statement.
Yeah.
Not the least of which is, we talk about a CRM application, for example, it's going to change constantly. Business requirements are going to change. Regulatory requirements are going to change. Privacy, security. These things are going to change, and that application has to be maintained constantly. What are your thoughts on maintaining that application purely in a prompt code-driven environment versus going back to a model and deploying it to a platform? How might that be different?
From a design point of view, it's tough. And there's sort of two elements to this. The one is, let me use prompting to define the changes I want to make. So, that's sort of doable. But then show me the results of this in a workable app, along with the ability to effectively test the results, et cetera, in a visual way. That's where it was really hard. Now, to be fair, if you're a hardcore developer, and you're looking at the results of what these things are generating, and those results are code rather than a model, and you are a dev who understands all of this code, then you could argue that as long as the code is there, I can just go and modify the code independently of utilizing some kind of prompt type tooling, and that is true. But it's not like that's good practice.
Right.
Because as soon as I get into that situation, then I've made changes. Now we have to manage things like versioning and tracking and auditing and everything else that goes along with this as well. And it was very hard to get my head around this with some of these applications, because when talking to a couple of these vendors, it's like, well, developers don't think about models this way. And I'm not talking about LLM-based models, the model of the app. They just think about they have a lot of code, and that code is everything from code that manages data, code that manages UX, code that manages logic and everything else associated with it, and they kind of figure it out. Well, when you're in an environment like I was trying to create here, the goal was not to ever have to touch the code. That was a really important goal for me as well. I didn't want to create something that was all about, I have to go and touch and figure out how to do things in a code, and then know how well or how not well the tools handle the lifecycle management of me touching the code. And now, does that represent how the tool now understands the application that it originally built in its own right? And in some cases, these tools do an okay job with this. In other cases, it's hard.
Hey, Dave, you teed up earlier a fundamental issue, I think, that is not necessarily clear, but is incredibly important. Workflow models, a lot of models in this world, workflow models, orchestration models exist for a reason. And they exist in order to manage the process outside of code. It's no coder wants to manage a complex, sophisticated workflow process in code. We decided long ago that wasn't the way to do it. Some of these things deploy to an orchestration and model workflow, and some do not, and some will give you a picture of it, and it's concerning that they think that's enough. Maybe some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so
especially given your background.
So the reason that I added the workflow element to this application, and keep in mind, mine were relatively simple. As soon as they become more complex, and I used to have a talk called "There's no such thing as simple workflow," and that still holds true today. But as soon as that happens, then you do need a way of being able to know what's actually happening with the process flow, how it's working, and in a way that isn't such that I need to be an analyst or a developer to know what's going on. I need to actually be the domain expert that understands what's happening here and have a visual experience that not necessarily allows me to interact with it. That's helpful, but certainly allows me to be able to see what is happening and when we make changes, what the impact of those changes are. And when you embed everything in coded logic, that just becomes hard. And, with some of the pure play vibe coding products, that's something that I had to live with. You look for the workflow and it kind of isn't there. Well, it is there, but it's just embedded in loads of code. And somehow you have to figure out what the heck is going on. And when you make a change, you don't know the impact of that change on anything else because all these apps have dependencies. And dependency management is another major reason why model-based applications exist today, because I have a way of understanding what really is going on. Just a simple thing. I have 5 forms, and some of the data inside, or some of the visuals inside those 5 forms, are common to each other, and they are bound to something, maybe a third-party data set. And now I make a change to the third-party data set or just one of these particular visuals. It is really important that I am told in a proactive way, you have made a change, and here's going to be the impact on this change on the whole application. Now, it is probably fair to say that when raising these topics with the pure play players, they just turn around and say, well, our infrastructure kind of handles that for you. The challenge for me is that may be true, but you don't actually know. And so, it was tough. It's also fair to say, and I want to be careful here. It's not like the process-centric vendors did all of this super well, because what many of them did is they overlaid a much more complex process model on top of all of the stuff than was actually necessary for the type of application that I had. Now, you could also argue that when that's all there, irrespective of whether it's been actually used or not, if at some point in time it is needed, that it's there in the plumbing to be managed effectively. And there's some truth to that. But it was very interesting going through this. And I think sometimes people forget about the fact that, a workflow model isn't just, a BPMN diagram or some kind of visual Visio-like diagram. It actually is connected to all elements of this application. And it's that connected nature and the visualization of that connected nature that makes this thing far more easy to manage, control, update, change, and govern than doing it a different way.
Orchestration. John.
Dave, thank you. We're gonna saw it off here, guys. Dave, thanks so much for the highlights. Dave has actually created 2 reports that describe what he learned, describe in a fair amount of detail the experiences he had with the range of products that he looked at, and I think a really interesting companion document that goes through a discussion of enterprise requirements and how enterprise requirements can play out or not in the products that Dave looked at. So we'll be publishing those soon on analysis.tech. And in the meantime, Dave, thank you so much. And last question for you. Are you going to look at some other products? Are you going to keep it going with this project?
I kind of have to keep it going because in some ways right now, as all of these vendors literally evolve on a weekly basis, you sort of have to keep up. I'll use one example. Zoho was one of the vendors I looked at. Zoho have a completely new architecture that they're announcing, and associated with that, it's going to change the way that people may have utilized a tool like Zoho in the past to do something like this, and hopefully for the better. And so it's going to be important to do that. I do want to make one last comment before we close off here. If there's one big takeaway for me, it's the fact that there is a place for all these players. it's not like I came out of this thinking there's a one size fits all for every kind of scenario that organizations have. It would be magnificent if there was, and certainly there are vendors who try to push that narrative. But the reality is it really isn't that way. And so depending on the goal and depending on the class of solution that one is creating, some of these technologies do an inordinately great job. And you could argue a better job than others that may be more comprehensive, more complex, more capable, in the nature. And then, I certainly expect that in the same way as some of these vibe coding players' revenue streams have radically changed and grown over the last, year or two, that the innovation associated with these particular players will grow at the same rate, if not more. And so, if we were going to have this discussion a year from now, it would be interesting to see whether similar attributes come up in the discussion, or whether, we just turn around and say, well, that one's checkbox has already been ticked and they've moved forward and it's no longer, a relevant issue.
Hey, folks, mark your calendar. August 25th, 2027. We'll come back and revisit where these tools are. Dave, Rob, thanks so much for jumping in and having this conversation. Folks, if you like conversations like this, if you like research like this is what we do at analysis.tech, and you can engage with us by dialing up analysis.tech. It's that simple. And thank you for joining. We'll see you on the next episode of The Lowdown by analysis.tech.